Ascultați Algoritmi și adicție, un podcast despre fenomenul jocurilor de noroc în România. Suntem Mădălina Muscă
și Raluca Durbacă, iar în următoarele 8 episoade vom analiza împreună cu invitatele și invitații noștri natura socială, politică și culturală a fenomenului jocurilor de noroc în România. Vom investiga ce este dependența de jocuri de noroc, cum se manifestă aceasta și ce opțiuni de tratament există pentru persoanele afectate de dependență. Vom analiza discursul industriei despre sine, cum comunică prin intermediul publicității, a influencerilor și a interminabilelor campanii de activare de brand. Vom investiga impactul pe care industria îl are asupra minorilor și tinerilor din România. Vom examina motivele pentru care presa ar trebui să fie independentă de influențele acestei industrii și vom cerceta felul în care industria folosește conceptul de joc responsabil ca pe o perdea de fum pentru a evita să-și asume responsabilitatea pentru produsele nocive pe care le vinde.
În acest prim episod vom discuta în limba engleză cu Gerda Reith, profesoară de științe sociale la Universitatea din Glasgow, despre locul pe care îl ocupă România în industria globală a jocurilor de noroc și despre lecțiile pe care le-am putea învăța din eforturile făcute de alte state ca să reglementeze această industrie. Today we are joined by Professor Gerda Reith, an influential scholar in gambling studies, sociologist at the University of Glasgow, whose work has been central in reshaping how we understand gambling and addiction. Rather than seeing addiction solely as an individual pathology, her research focuses on wider social, cultural, and political contexts. Professor Reith has written extensively about risky consumption, the cultural meanings of gambling, and the social consequences of addiction. She has been involved in studies in different national and international contexts, in major longitudinal studies that trace people's gambling careers over time. Her work highlights the role of technology, marketing, and policy in shaping gambling behaviors. She also contributed to the Lancet Public Health Commission on Gambling report, which called for gambling to be reframed as a global public health challenge, moving beyond the industry's mantra of responsible gambling and placing greater emphasis on structural responsibility. In her work, she has described mobile and social gambling as the new frontier, a world where smartphones create a casino in your pocket, blurring the boundaries between gaming and gambling, collecting massive amounts of personal data, and embedding gambling into the fabric of everyday digital life. In this episode, we'll talk with Professor Reith about the social nature of addiction, the evolving landscape of gambling in the digital age, the policy lessons that countries like Romania might draw from her work, and many more. Professor Reith, thank you for accepting our invitation. We are honored to have you as a guest in our podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Please, can you tell us what first drew you to the study of gambling? How did your academic journey lead into this field of addiction research?
Well, I guess I was first interested in some of the big ideas involved in addiction and gambling. I thought the idea of addiction was really interesting because it brings up ideas about individual responsibility versus structural determinants and free will. And from that, I thought gambling was just a really, really interesting little microcosm, a great example of these things in practice. And also because it involved two things that people are really very concerned about, one of which is money and the other one is chance. So if you put these together in gambling with an enormous commercial industry behind it, you get something really interesting from a sociological perspective.
You've been involved in different longitudinal studies that trace what you call gambling careers. Can you first tell us what does gambling careers mean, this concept of gambling career, and what these projects in which you've been involved reveal about the dynamics of the gambling industry?
Well, the idea of gambling career is, first of all, what it's not. It's not about people who have careers in the gambling industry. It was the idea of bringing a sociological concept to the study of gambling, which I thought had been quite static up to that point. There's this idea that gambling is something that people just have. You know, people are born to be someone who has problems with gambling. And I thought that sounds far too simplistic because it's such a social practice. How can this be so? So the team that I worked with decided to look at the way that people's gambling behaviour evolved over time and to see what that tells us about what gambling looks like. So the idea of careers was that we would take a cohort, a group of people, and follow them over 5 years, and just to see what changed in their gambling behaviour and how that changed in relationship to their lives in general. And what we found was so interesting, and it showed us that gambling is incredibly fluid. It's not static behaviour at all. It changes all the time. So people who gambled heavily would often move in and out of periods of problematic play, but they would sometimes go back. And people who started off as not having any problems would sometimes then find themselves developing quite extreme problems, but then pull back from them again. And these things didn't happen in isolation. None of this went on in a vacuum. And when we looked at it more closely, we found that these changes were related to their environments, so where they lived, how accessible gambling was, how easy it was to play particular games, their family backgrounds, so whether people who they lived with gambled and showed them what to do and made it something that was culturally acceptable, what their friends did, and simple things like getting a bonus at work might encourage people to put on a bet, or at the same time, maybe losing a job would encourage people to play more, to try and make up the lost money. So all of these social things were what drove changes in gambling behaviour. And at the time when the focus was very much on individual psychological factors and ideas about responsible gambling, I thought this was a really important finding because it showed that actually what drives gambling behaviour change is external to individuals. It's their environment, where they live, and who they socialise with. So I thought that was a really important and interesting finding in that particular point in time.
Well, in Romania in particular, gambling was introduced first through sports betting, and then they went on to introduce electronic slot machines. Because you've studied how gambling companies infiltrate sports culture through sponsorships and marketing, and maybe you can talk a bit about the mechanisms through which they do this.
Yeah, that's really interesting that gambling was introduced to Romania in that way, because that has happened in other countries too. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think the mechanism here is really quite sophisticated in a way. I mean, on the most visible sign of it is, as you said, the marketing and the sponsorship, where betting companies align themselves with sports companies, and well, they provide financial incentives for that, for those relationships. So we can see that. We can see the sports shirts, players promote the brand and so on. And it's very visible and it's quite obvious. But I think the industry drive these connections in more subtle ways as well. There's more subtle things that underlie it. And what they do, and this taps particularly into male cohorts, they tap into, one is ideas about masculinity. So it's the idea that betting is it's a risky thing to do, but it's also a sign that you're a bit brave, that you've got special skills, that you've got the guts to risk some money on a bet. So it taps into those ideas about masculinity, and it also taps into ideas about sports fandom. So by aligning themselves with particular teams, gambling companies are kind of saying, we're part of this team, we're part of the fun and the action. And, if you support this team, show how you support them, put a bet on them, show that you've got confidence that they'll win this game by placing a bet on this match. And that's a lot more pervasive, really, because it sets up this idea that sports and betting are synonymous. They're two sides of the same coin. And some of the promotional materials for sports betting, in Britain at least, are, it's no fun unless you've got a bet on it. Or, where's the fun if there's no action? So it becomes the idea that you're not really a true fan if you don't bet. So both of these things together, by tapping into fandom and by tapping into ideas about masculinity, promote the idea that betting is just part of being one of the lads, and it shows support with your team. And particular technologies have grown up around this to support it and to entrench it even further. In Britain, there's a technique called in-play, in-match betting. I think it's spread into other jurisdictions, but I think it started in Great Britain. And in that sense, you can bet live as a match actually unfolds. So you don't just have to have a one-off bet on maybe who'll win, what the best team will be. You can bet on micro events within a game, like who'll get the next penalty, or will someone take a corner. And for sports fans, this is really, really compelling because they talk about these things anyway. So now they can put money behind their opinion and gain from it. And within any one match, there will be dozens, probably hundreds of these micro events. So rather than having one or two bets on a game, you can now have hundreds in real time as it's happening, when emotions are high, people are excited, they're engaged, and so they're maybe betting more, more impulsively.
And this also has changed the nature of sports betting, because it's not about knowledge of sports and or your favorite sport anymore. It's about taking a chance on what someone will do during a game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And by taking that chance, you're backing up your opinion with something concrete and important, which is money, and also showing to your group, to your social cohort, that you can do this. So it can become a sign of status and prestige. If you get it right, then you're seen as having these skills, although mostly it's nothing to do with skill. And interestingly, this is the way that it was introduced to Romania, because this is exactly what happens throughout sub-Saharan Africa as well. Gambling corporations capitalized on particularly in countries like Nigeria, they capitalized on the popularity of football across the continent, not necessarily betting, but football. And on the back of that, they brought in gambling corporations who then did these alignments with slight modifications. They made it more about winning money than showing status, but it was the same kind of dynamic and the same way to get betting into a country on a large scale.
I was wondering if we can talk a bit about this concept of responsible gambling. As I was telling you previously, it's been introduced as a preventive measure for gambling addicts, and it's been it's a slogan in Romania. It's presented on every ad. Play responsibly, which implies the idea of action, of playing, but responsibly in a way.
Yeah.
And maybe you can deconstruct it for us a little bit more. Why is this a bad idea of introducing this concept in as a preventive and treatment measure for addiction?
Oh, it's almost a universal concept. Wherever the gambling industry goes, responsible gambling follows. It's like cause and effect. And it annoys me greatly. It's not a useful concept at all. It's one that the gambling industry find incredibly useful. For them, it is useful because what it actually serves to do is it deflects attention from the actual drivers of harm. And I think one way of thinking about responsible gambling is to think, well, it only seems to apply to individuals who gamble. Doesn't apply quite so much to corporations, to the industry themselves. Doesn't seem to apply so much to governments. It's purely a player-directed messaging system, and it's a framing that is very industry friendly, and it's part of a bigger neoliberal ideology of making individuals responsible for their own actions and removing responsibility from any other external sectors. So in that kind of framing, the industry frames itself as a provider of, just fun, leisure, entertainment, and also economic wealth. So it's all about harmless fun for a supposed majority who gamble responsibly, and harms or problems are framed as the consequence of poor choices, psychological deficits by an individual who fail to gamble responsibly. So it's fairly obvious from that it's a form of gaslighting, I guess you could say. It's a form of victim blaming. The individual becomes responsible for their own downfall. It's a way of deflecting what actually causes harms in the first place. And it also, and this is the important part, it makes the solutions individualized as well. So within that framing, the solution to gambling problems becomes things that are directed purely at individuals, like counselling, like treatment. And industry are quite happy to invest, usually, in things like treatment services, because as they present it, they're treating these unfortunate few who just aren't able to enjoy the fun of gambling like most people. So they're quite happy to be benevolent and try and help them where they can. But actually, the harms that are caused are, we have to ask, why do we look to individuals as the source of this problem and not the products and the practices of the wider industry as the source of the problem? So it's a great way of deflecting from that bigger picture thinking. And also, of course, it's tied up with moral discourses and ideas about shame and stigma. And many gamblers who have problems with their behavior, they subscribe to this themselves. They do believe that there's a problem within them. And that's often the source of even more distress, because then they feel guilty, they feel shame, they feel stigma. So it's really quite a harmful concept, I would say, on many, many levels.
And reframing this concept would go into what you analyzed for the Lancet report, into putting gambling in a public health paradigm, right?
Yeah. I think, rather than looking at the individual as the source of the problem, you look at the products, the practices, and the whole environment that commercial gambling goes on in. And you think, well, this affects entire populations of people. And rather than treating a few individuals after they become harmed, the task then is to protect the far wider public who are exposed to these things, to prevent them from becoming harmed in the first place. And that reframes it to looking at protecting the health or the wealth and the well-being of the wider population who are exposed to these things, whether they gamble or not.
And basically what you suggested is to have some structural accountability, to have some policy that is directly oriented in the Public Health Commission of Gambling. It was directly meant to get to some policy stakeholders. I don't know if that really worked, if that got anywhere, but your study meant also that you compared different countries. You did a comparison of different cultural, economic, and regulatory contexts. How can we do this? How meaningful it is to do this comparison, and why it is important to do that?
That's a really good question, and a really important question on lots of levels. I think the importance of making these international comparisons is to be aware of the trends across gambling globally. So the most important thing is to be aware of the global picture. I think countries can often feel maybe siloed or alone when gambling appears in a country that didn't previously have it. And they might not realize that this is actually part of a trend, it's part of a wider pattern. I mean, I think it's also worth remembering the size of gambling globally, which we pulled out in the Lancet. It's now, some form of gambling is now legal in 80% of countries globally, which is, really quite astounding, given that, well, a lot of countries ban it altogether. It's a really high number. 80% of countries allow some kind of gambling. And given that most people don't really engage in gambling, or they don't engage in it regularly or heavily, that shows that the intent of the industry, that is industry-driven growth. That's not consumer demand. That's an industry push. And also, there are now approximately 80 million people who suffer from gambling disorder globally. And that's just the most extreme end of the of the problem. Those who are have risky gambling behaviour and who are at risk of more severe harms, that's nearly 450 million people. So if you've got 450 million people who are engaging in risky or problematic gambling, and then you've got 6 for every one of those, you've got another 6 people who will experience negative consequences. You're looking at really big numbers there, really big numbers for an activity that's not particularly popular. And so having that comparative angle can be really helpful. If you could say, for example, in Romania, if you can look abroad and think, well, this happened in sub-Saharan Africa, this has just happened in Georgia. We are not alone. This is part of a bigger trend. And these countries did this, and that was helpful. So maybe we could do that, and that will be helpful for us. So having that bird's eye view on the industry's practices, trends in commercial gambling, and the ways that it moves across the globe, which it does, that can be really useful for informing policy of which areas to focus on, and for signposting civil society organisations to what they should maybe be looking at if gambling is coming to their jurisdiction. So that's, in that sense, it's very important because countries can learn from each other and they can compare what works in terms of regulation and policy. But there's also, in some ways, there's also a slight downside to asking that question. And I was thinking about this. When you look at it that way in terms of an international global comparison, it can be very useful. But then there's another aspect when you can wonder, is it meaningful to make these kinds of comparisons given national, cultural, economic differences? And I would say it's huge, even more important that should happen, because one thing that my experience working in policy has shown over really quite recently, over the last few years, few months, is that the industry are very keen to highlight the idea of international differences being a barrier to research and to global action. And the idea is that, well, there's so many differences in gambling across jurisdictions, across different countries, that really you can't compare. You can't compare anything. For example, there was a debate about the harms of machine gambling in Britain recently. And we have a lot of evidence on the harms of specifically machine gambling, most of which comes from Australia. But at parliamentary evidence sessions and in policy discussions, the industry pushed back against this evidence, saying that, well, but those studies were done in Australia and it's different here, so you can't use that in a British context. So the ultimate outcome from those debates and those sessions was that researchers go off to do yet more studies of something that we really already know the answer to, looking for such fine-grained specificity. And yeah, it will show some slight differences, but really not important ones. So it's a way of wasting time, of undermining consensus where it does exist. And that is, I would say, that's an industry tactic that maybe hasn't been flagged so much. This idea that you can't compare things. Actually, you can. And the global similarities are far more important than the national differences when it comes to commercial gambling products. The things that we know are harmful across the board. Things like speed, rate of play, accessibility, whether that's in Romania or Africa or North America. There are basic similarities that stand, and we shouldn't get too distracted with looking for the minute, fine-grained differences too much.
And one of the similarity is the fact that gambling has become accessible anytime and anywhere for everybody. And you describe this access through your smartphone as a casino in your pocket, basically. What does it mean that you have a casino in your pocket, and how this mobile gambling is reshaping the tempo of gambling in the integration of this practice in everyday life?
Well, this is the $100 question, and this has seen a huge change there's been an enormous shift from what were, I guess, traditional gambling, because I think still most people, when you talk about gambling, they think about things like land-based casinos and betting shops and physical machines, things you can touch and see and walk into, bingo halls. But actually, most gambling now is not like that. Gambling has become a digital product. And this transformation happened so quickly, really over a decade. Gambling has been taken from these terrestrial environments and almost literally put onto smartphones. I mean, obviously, physical gambling venues still exist and they're still very lucrative and they're used. But the trend now is for digital gambling to take the ascendance. And all the games that we know of, slots, casino games, bingo games, even lotteries, these can all be played now on smartphones due to a whole ecosystem of technology. So it's not just about the gambling industry here. It's about digital and financial systems. It's about information technology, data gathering, geolocation software, which are all embedded in smartphones. And they mean that people can play very, very quickly. So you can repeat a game instantaneously, almost as quickly as you can press a button on your phone. You can bet. And of course, there are no spatial constraints on this, as long as you have access to some kind of Wi-Fi signal or some kind of data, then you can bet. So people can bet on their way into work, on their way to the shops. They can bet while they're sitting in their own house watching TV. The pace of gambling has sped up and the extensivity of it has also sped up. So you can do it almost as an afterthought. It fills in the spaces in everyday life. And this is really novel. It never used to be like this. You had to make an effort, some kind of effort, to go to gamble in previous times. And now that stopgap is removed and people can have immediate access to almost any kind of game that's available. There's always a gamble being placed. There's always a bet you can place at any time, day or night, wherever you are in the world. And that changes the nature of gambling exponentially, I think. It makes it a far more intensive experience as well.
Can you talk a bit more maybe about the social implications of this? In your research, you call it a form of hyperconsumption because it's so accessible, right? That's the reason why you've identified it. And maybe you can talk a bit more about the social implication. We've interviewed some addicts, gambling addicts in Romania, and some of them have talked about how they would practice sports betting, like in real life, let's call it in real life, not in a digital life.
Yeah.
And then due to the pandemic, they've started doing that online and they've become highly addict to gambling because of it. So maybe if you can talk a bit more about the implication of this form of hyperconsumption and how it changes everyday life, actually.
Yeah, well, it certainly does that for people who get really invested in it. I think one of the things that the social aspect is that you can be far more immersed in this kind of activity. It's more all-encompassing. It can take over a world far more quickly, and of course, it's practically invisible. It's very easy to hide. You just switch off a phone or put it down, or close a laptop. And I think the pandemic did have a big effect on people's gambling behaviours because there was less to do. You couldn't go out, there were less social connections, but gambling was a constant. That was always available. Research that I did during COVID would show people betting on bizarre games when sports stopped, when real life sports stopped existing, then made up sports took over. So you would have people putting bets on dematerialized games that didn't even exist. They weren't even actually being played by real people in real time. They were just avatar type spectacles. And I mean, gambling is a dematerialized form of consumption anyway, because there's no physical product there. You're just you're paying for an experience, which is an experience of potentially winning money. So it's almost the intermediary of a product or even a service is gone, which is really unusual. There aren't any other products like that I can think of. So once you take away the kind of intermediary and you have this pure dematerialized type of consumption, you can manipulate it in so many ways. You can make it faster, you can change its form, and all of this is done through technology. It's almost the perfect product because it's very cheap to do that for an industry, because you don't need, once you master technology, you don't really need to do much else. And you can constantly upgrade it and change the form of it to make it appealing to people. And another thing, I guess, I probably should have mentioned before, that makes this all the more engaging and difficult to move away from for people when it becomes digital and online is the fact that companies have lots of tactics and lots of tricks that they use to keep people, to get people to play, to make it difficult to stop, to keep them playing for longer and longer, and actually makes it quite hard for them to stop a game once they're in it. So things like targeted marketing, for example, uses data to direct particular kinds of personalized offers to people based on their past history. So gambling companies gather enormous amounts of data on their customers, more than most companies. They record every transaction that's made is recorded somewhere, and from this they can build up very fine-grained profiles of who their customers are, what they like, what they don't like, what might encourage them to play, what stops them from playing. And once they have all this data, they can then interact with those customers to encourage them to play more, to send them special offers, to send them inducements, to encourage them to carry on, to cross-sell their products. So, if you play one type of gambling that might be fairly low risk, say maybe the occasional lottery purchase, but from that they might think, well, this person might like online Keno draws, which are drawn far more regularly, hourly, rather than, say, weekly or daily. So they might try and induce this kind of cross-selling to encourage someone to shift into a more lucrative but far more risky form of consumption. They can send free bets when they realize that someone's almost out of money. They will be aware that they've bet far too much, maybe overspent their limit, and then they can direct them with a free bet to keep them going, maybe give them a little bit more money to lose a little bit more cash. And things like geolocation as well is part of that mix to encourage people to move to areas where there are terrestrial bets, if that's the kind of thing that they know this customer likes.
So they use all of this data that they collect from people who practice online gambling to actually give them like a personalized offers in order to attract them even more into gambling, so they can extract even more money from them. This is through losses.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is terrible.
It's the idea of Natasha Schull, the American writer, called it addiction by design. And she pointed out that the aim of gambling companies is to get people to play for as long as possible. Quite simple, because the longer you play, the longer you bet, the more you will lose over time. It's a very simple motive, and there are lots of strategies and techniques that make it happen. And the idea of addiction by design was designed for gambling machines in Las Vegas, but it applies even more to mobile and digital forms of gambling. I think it applies even better because the design of these games, the algorithms that drive them, the forms of data analysis that underlie targeted marketing and so on, and personalized offers, they are all purely designed to get people to play more. That is the bottom line. That's the business model that this industry is built on. And it has to do that because there's actually a relatively small number of people who play games like this, who bet quite heavily. From an economics point of view, they do not have a very big market, so they have to get as much money as they can from those people who do gamble to make it worthwhile. So it's incredibly competitive, and I think that's sometimes something that's missed. Most people don't gamble. It's not a majority occupation at all. Some Australian research showed that around about 60% of the revenue, which means player losses or industry profit, around 60% of that for machines comes from something like 5% of players. Those kinds of percentages are found throughout almost all of aspects of the industry. It's a very small market. This is why the advertising and the promotions and the marketing are so cutthroat, because it's, companies are really competing against each other for this very, very lucrative small proportion of the population, tiny proportion of the population.
In Romania, when in-house, when live, sorry, not live, I don't know how to call it, in real life betting was more popular, they had these techniques of calling people or sending them messages to remind them, oh, we can offer you this and that and this and that. Now we see them going through social media to different accounts and platforms and communities and advertising there, all sorts of free spins or X amount of bonuses that they can have for that specific day, encouraging them to just keep making accounts and keep joining these 33. We have 33 online gambling operators in Romania. Each of them has a website, an online casino. And we can see that, and their methods, marketing methods, are very inventive.
That's a good word for it. A nice euphemism. They have top psychologists on these, and they work, they put a lot of research into this, far more than we do, far more than academics are able to do. Yeah. And the incorporation of any kind of social media platform is another trend that's part of the this hyperdrive to digital online gambling. And that's something else that I've noticed that has really attempted to draw in new markets of people, particularly younger people. There's been a trend for lots of corporations have given themselves, well, obviously they have an online presence, but they've also moved to have an online social media presence. So they infiltrate social media platforms. They utilize influencers and celebrities, and these are really persuasive techniques, because young people listen to influencers, and again, by moving into that kind of digital ecosystem, by moving into the digital world of young people, companies they align themselves with the cultural values and the norms and even the memes that young people recognize, almost in the same way that the industry does with its football. Moving into the world of football, it shifts into these spaces for young people and engages with them through their own norms, I think. And I think, again, that's really quite pernicious, because it makes them seem like not like a friend, but it makes them seem like they're on the same level as the young people that they're trying to engage with. And the use of influencers ramps this up 100-fold.
Yeah, we see that in Romania quite a lot. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about games and gamification and the way in which, because there are a lot of harmless, what we might call harmless games, right? The young people can play on their phones, but these games also employ strategies that sooner or later teach them how to gamble, or or at least to have an inclination towards gambling.
Yeah.
I think you've studied it a bit.
This is one of the things that we looked at in the Lancet Commission report, and we found that there's an increasing convergence between gambling, the legal definition of gambling with money, and gaming type elements in otherwise neutral games. And it's defined gaming type elements, things like loot boxes or unexpected rewards, these kinds of mechanisms. And they're not technically gambling, because they don't involve they don't involve money and that kind of transaction, but they do involve the same kind of logics as gambling. They kind of train people to expect something unexpected. They get the idea across that it's quite normal and quite exciting to maybe put forward something of value in your game. In a child's game, that might be a skin or something, to wager in inverted commas something that's valuable to you and not know what you're going to get, or to open a loot box and not know what's inside it. So people aren't gambling with money, so it's not gambling, so it's not regulated. There's no oversight of this stuff, but it's exactly the same kind of mindset that is behind gambling. And what this is doing is, I think, training up the next generation of gamblers. I mean, right now, these kids are 10, 11, 12, 13. They're too young to gamble. They don't even have their own money most of the time. But it's inculcating the mindset that this is something that's fun, it's pleasurable, it's sociable, because your friends are also online in your game and they're doing it too. And you talk about this, you can compare notes. There's some status involved in it, who got the best loot box. So all of these things are training kids to associate these kinds of mechanisms with positive emotions, with positive experiences. But in some jurisdictions in North America and also in Australia, before particular kinds of sports betting were legalized, companies would introduce gaming-like games simply to get, not gambling, there's no betting involved, but they would introduce gaming-type events simply to promote their brand. So this was gaming by the back door, and they knew, or they suspected, that the market was going to be liberalized and that real betting would be allowed in the near future. So this tactic was to get brand awareness for their brand, so that people would already associate them with these kinds of positive experiences with gaming. And then when betting was legalized, that would transfer, the brand name would stay, but the technique would actually be betting. So it happens on that level too. It's about brand awareness.
We see that in Romanian, it's called brand activation, and we see that in music festivals with young children, and which are sponsored by a gambling operator. They can bet on what the artists, the musicians are going to do. It's kind of like an in-play betting technique. They're teaching them how to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when in-play betting does come, these people will know exactly what to do, and they'll know that it's fun. They'll already associate it with these hugely formative experiences, probably for many, maybe their first music festival. Brand activation, it's the same. Another corporations do this. McDonald's try to build emotional connections with children with their Happy Meals. And some of these things are loss leaders, but they're in it for the long term, and they want to build up a loyal customer base.
And so basically with this constant engagement of people, we have this encouragement of excessive play, first of all, and then we have the other strategy probably, and from what I understand, to normalize this gambling activity. So basically, if we see it all around us, it's normal. If everybody plays it or has met with it online or through football players' shirts, then betting is something that we socially accept very easily. And this, from what I understand from you, is very dangerous. How far should the regulation go in limiting this marketing technique?
I think it needs to be far more aware of the risks and the harms that are involved, and regulate very, very heavily in the public interest. At the moment, regulation across the world is a patchwork. Some countries have reasonably stringent regulations. Others have none at all. Some have bits. And regulators globally really need to be aware of the fact that what they have here it's not an ordinary product. It's not like other forms of leisure or entertainment. This is something that does have a genuine risk to public health and well-being. The harms The harms of gambling are extensive and well-researched. The costs of those harms are less well-researched, but also extensive. And we do know that the costs are extensive too. So regulators have to, discharge their ethical duty to protect people's well-being from the most extreme forms of these promotions. And by extreme forms, I mean things like targeted betting, surveillance, the use of surveillance type technologies, things like personalized marketing, the constant ubiquitous advertising and promotions, which most people do not like. Opinion surveys show that people don't like any of this. Gambling is normalized on the one hand, but this is an industry framing of the situation. It is normalized because it's ubiquitous and they're kind of forced to engage with it. But if you ask people what they think about this normalization and this ubiquity, they don't like it. Very few people say, "Oh, it's fine, I don't mind it." Survey after survey shows that people would prefer less promotion, less advertising, less marketing. So regulators need to be aware of this, and they need to be very aware of the harms that these more intensive forms of betting cause. I think promotion and marketing, well, personally, I think it needs to be treated much the same as tobacco marketing and removed from the public arena. We don't need it. We certainly don't need it. The gambling industry will survive without this constant ubiquitous marketing. So let's just get rid of it. It would mean a smaller market slightly, but I think that would be a start. And I think all personalization should be removed as well.
Because as you were mentioning, this is a public health problem. This is not just something that is individual
absolutely
clinical problem, or you have a psychological
and there's direct correlation between where the industry moves into a jurisdiction, problems and the harms of gambling increase. So that's well understood now. So that needs to be rolled back on. And also, I think regulators need to be really aware that companies introduce new products all the time, and they have to be on top of this, because the speed of innovation in the industry is very fast indeed, and regulators tend to be quite slow, so they don't always catch up with the latest products and the latest innovations, and that's dangerous. They do need to be on top of this. There's no other product that I can think of that would get away with a lack of consumer health warnings, or think of all the labeling that's involved in food and drink, and all the regulations that a new food product would need to go through before it ends up on supermarket shelves. Gambling should be like that. It should be clearly labeled. It should be tested for safety. Think of all the products regulations around selling things like cars. These things are, they're regulated and monitored to protect the health of the public, and gambling products are not. So before a new gambling product goes to market, it needs to prove it's safe. And I think there would be far fewer products go to market if they had to prove that, but that would be a job for regulators.
So this shifts that are happening in the gambling industry, you are describing them as tied to more global and broader neoliberal and political economics and economical structures. And what you say is that one of the public health frameworks that this can be approached is by limiting the and having safety and precautions instructions for it. But this is like a global phenomena, but deeply embedded in state revenues for one side and in political power on the other side. And do you think we can have this broader, global, or international approach to how we deal with gambling?
Realistically, I think it'd be very difficult, but pragmatically, I think it has to happen because gambling has to be, obviously, it has to be regulated, but it needs to be regulated at the global level because of the nature of the industry. The industry is dominated by a few very large global brands that have lots of offshoots that operate in different countries. And the way that they work is that these offshoot brands they move into different global jurisdictions depending on things like regulations, operating costs, or what the industry would describe as new markets. So if you have regulation in one jurisdiction that produces a relatively safe industry, the chances are that at some point an offshoot of the corporation that works, that operates in that jurisdiction will simply shift. It'll go somewhere else and open up corporations in another jurisdiction where the regulations aren't as strict and where the operating costs are lower and where it sees untapped potential for growth. So it's almost like, the game whack-a-mole, if you hit one, another one pops up somewhere else. You need to have oversight of the whole picture so that you can regulate all of this.
It's a global oversight and regulation would ensure that we put not an end, because I understand it's really complicated to completely ban gambling because it will only show up in the black market, but at least regulate it to a degree that it doesn't cause so many societal problems that are very hard to manage after that by the states, and the societal costs, which we don't even calculate, because I'm quite certain that Romanian politicians don't really understand what societal costs are. In Romania, part of the public speech that both the industry and the political class uses is that we are receiving so much money for the state budget, money which we don't have anywhere else to get it from. So we need this industry. So it's framed like this. Have you encountered in your research this type of discourse about gambling in other states?
Oh, absolutely. This is always how they get their foot in the door, I would say. It's always about economic revenue, job creation, wealth, taxation. They talk about job creation is one very physical sign. So they create jobs, that creates employment, that increases wealth. Regeneration is another argument. All these economic arguments. And when you look at where gambling has been permitted across the globe, this is always the reason for that, for allowing it to be permitted. It's because economic argument. But the thing that people don't realize is that money that creates industry profits, that creates taxation, that has to come from somewhere. And because there's no real product involved, because it's such an insubstantial form of consumption, the money comes directly from people who are playing the games, which is usually local populations. So sure, it directs money to state revenue, it directs money to private profit gains, but it comes from local populations. So overall, it's very, very seldom an increase. And that's been an argument that's been used across the board. And it's very persuasive. And if you look at the ledgers, then you do see the tax numbers go up and the profit numbers go up. But what politicians often don't think about is where the money comes from in the first place. So if people are spending that money on gambling, they're not spending it on other things. And they're potentially going into debt, losing their jobs, marriage breakdown, losing their home. So they're actually becoming a burden on the state, and that's costing the state money. So money is going out of the coffers for other things. But it takes a little while for governments and for politicians to start thinking like that, because in the early days, it's all about this promise of wealth. A few states in the US and also in Australia have recognised that the only way to have a profitable casino in your state is to have one that excludes locals. So you can have a casino and it will create the jobs, but the wealth, the money that is left behind in the casino is from out-of-towners, from visitors, from tourists, but not from people who live in that state. And that's really the only way a casino can be profitable for a nation, for a state. It's easy to look at tax gains and profits. They're black and white numbers on a spreadsheet. They're very easy to calculate, but the costs of gambling are much harder to calculate, and there's much less interest in doing so. So there aren't such good figures for that.
As I was mentioning earlier also, we are just starting research into this problem, into this phenomenon, and it's a initiative coming from individuals, not from the state, which is very poor of the state. It should do better, in my opinion, with this, given that there is such a high problem with gambling in Romania. And also initiatives for regulating the market have been scarce, but they are beginning to show up. Do you think you can suggest some priorities or focus priorities for us? What should we focus on when trying to research this field in Romania, but also try and propose some public policies for regulating this problem, national problem?
Yeah. It's such a difficult question, but I mean, there are a few things that you can do and that are worth flagging from the experience of other places. I mean, one thing I suppose to be aware of is to take control of the framing, the discourse that the industry use. This idea about responsible gambling and the industry is something that brings economic wealth and regeneration and jobs. At every opportunity, push back against that and just point out that actually this great economic wealth creator is not so. This is a myth, and point to the fact that the industry is this global feature that moves around where conditions are most favourable to it. It's a commercial entity. It's not about creating wealth for states. It's just not about that. So that very simple point is sometimes forgotten, but that needs to be brought home and push back against the responsible gambling framing and simply make the point that actually gambling products and gambling practices cause harm, and these harms create huge amounts of suffering, and also they have huge social costs. So that's something to always put first and foremost. I don't think there's any point trying to engage with the responsible gambling framing. It's just the wrong line to go down. You just have to say that we are not talking that language. We have a better language, a more accurate language. So it's always really helpful to do that. And I think sometimes when countries start off on this route, some of the things they get given is, well, we'll provide more treatment. And that's okay. Treatment is important. When people are harmed, they do need to have treatment and they need to have access to support. But it can be a sideshow, and sometimes people can go down the line of trying to research what kind of treatment works, what treatment works best, what's the best way to get people into treatment, all these issues around treatment. And I'm not saying that's not important, but in the initial stages, if you want to control gambling, you need to think about prevention. And prevention comes way before treatment. Ideally, you want a state where you don't need to provide any treatment because no one needs it. So again, not to get pulled down the treatment support line too early, although that's difficult because you also need to engage people who have been harmed by gambling to make your points and to advocate with you, and they will need these things. So it's a very fine line there, but just to be aware that that sometimes can be a path that doesn't lead you to your ultimate goals. again, being aware that what Romania is experiencing is not unique and that other countries are being targeted, treated in exactly the same way. That could be very powerful because that knowledge elevates what can be seen as a singular experience into something that's actually global and has far more extensive drivers. So you're part of a bigger group of countries in that sense. One thing that we've learned in Britain from the experience in Britain is that, and I say this with caution, but awareness raising is really important. And I always thought that was a weak, raise awareness. I always thought that was kind of a weak suggestion, but I've come to realize why it's useful in the long run. And you have to have public awareness raised to a certain level in order to get political buy-in, because most politicians will only act if there's public support for an issue. So in the past, colleagues and I have gone directly to political organizations and political individuals and told them, this is happening, this is terrible. And they might agree personally, but they won't do anything unless there's far more public buy-in, because that's just not what politicians do. So you have to have a level of public awareness and public support behind you for an issue. And in order to do that, and I've noticed this recently in Britain, just in the last year, I think this has actually started to come together. You need to get gambling harms onto the agenda of a range of civil society organisations that might, on the surface, look like they deal with other things. So you need to get that onto their agenda and build relationships with them, and also integrate them with people who have lived experience of harm. So get these organisations and individuals together. And these organisations are things like agencies that deal with things like homelessness, debt, suicide, mental health, domestic violence, alcohol problems. All of these quite disparate organisations, gambling issues tap into all of these issues, all of them. And once they realise that, then it's almost like a light bulb moment for some of them. That way you can bring them together, and then you have the power of all these other organizations who already have some kind of buy-in in civil society, and they have some kind of connections, and you can mobilize the power of that group as a whole, rather than just talking about gambling as a single issue. It's about feeding it into all these other issues. Gambling becomes a common thread, and then you get critical mass. And it might not be the main point of any one of these organizations, but it will certainly be a contributing factor. And I think it's incredible when you compare the timescale of political and regulatory change and policy change to the speed of the industry. I mean, by the time a regulation to produce exclusion comes in, the industry will be light years ahead and will have introduced something completely different. And in terms of regulation, I mean, talking about the speed of change and the speed of the industry, I think a really important regulatory principle has to be the precautionary principle. So before any new innovation is made, before a new product is introduced, before a new practice is rolled out, rather than just do it and then see what happens, have to apply the precautionary principle, and the industry need to be put on the back foot, and they need to prove the safety of their innovation before they can do anything with it. That's such a basic thing, because at the moment we don't have that. They can innovate and develop something new, bring it to market, and then maybe it takes months, maybe it takes years to see the side effects, to see the consequences. And by that time, hundreds, thousands of people have been harmed. And then by the time it takes to research the impacts and propose changes to legislation, we're years down the line. So to get around all of that, you simply have to say you can't introduce anything new until you've proved that it's safe. It's the way any other product innovation works, and they should not be exempt from that.
Yeah, you're right. I think this is what happened with the in-play betting if they would have tested it before.
Yeah, and it would be very hard to prove that it's safe. But they ask for standards of evidence that they would never demand of themselves. They ask researchers to prove causation. When you talk about advertising and marketing and the harmful impacts of that, they ask to see proof of a causal relationship between marketing and harm. And it's so difficult to prove causation in social science. It's hard to prove causation in physical science, but it's particularly hard in social science, and you shouldn't need that level, that standard of proof to show that something might be harmful. So that, again, that framing has to be turned back on them and say, well, no, we're not going to prove anything, but you have to prove the safety of your product, just like any other company.
I mean, we test foods, we test medicine, we
Yes,
test everything.
Of course.
We don't test gambling products,
No.
Yeah, paradoxically.
Yeah. Foods go through rigorous testing before they go to market. Medicines do. Lots of consumer goods and services have to prove their safety first, and the gambling industry gets around that. Well, my argument would be, well, they describe themselves as just another leisure industry, just another fun product, so prove it, like other leisure industries have to. Prove that the roller coaster is safe before people climb on.
Ați ascultat Algoritmi și adicție, un podcast despre fenomenul jocurilor de noroc în România. În episodul următor discutăm cu Viorel Roman, psiholog clinician și psihoterapeut, despre dependența de jocuri de noroc.
Proiectul Algoritmi și adicție este o cercetare multimedia interdisciplinară despre jocurile de noroc online și impactul acestui fenomen asupra societății românești, cofinanțat de Administrația Fondului Cultural Național. Toate materialele cercetării pot fi accesate online pe adresa www.cinefocus.ro, precum și pe toate platformele digitale ale proiectului. Proiectul nu reprezintă în mod necesar poziția Administrației Fondului Cultural Național. AFCN nu este responsabilă de conținutul proiectului sau de modul în care rezultatele proiectului pot fi folosite. Acestea sunt în întregime responsabilitatea beneficiarului finanțării. Pe curând!